Close your eyes for a moment. When I say the words sexual violence, what are the first images that come to mind? Is it a person, a scene, something you've seen online? You can open your eyes. Do the images you see impact the kinds of conversations you have about sexual violence, or who you have them with? I believe they do. And I've learned that too many of us enter into those conversations with the images of men as aggressors, images that get in the way of us supporting survivors and creating a culture that allows sexual violence to take place at all. And I can't help but ask myself, how do these images impact the way we interact with the real men in our lives, the real men who aren't rapists? So I want to introduce you to a real man in my life. This is Russ. So Russ is not a rapist. He's also not my husband. Russ has been my best friend for over 20 years. And our friendship began in earnest on the campus of Brown University in the stairwell of my freshman dormitory. I believe I was crumbled in a tiny ball, sobbing. You see, the summer before, a high school friend raped me. And before that, my grandparents, both of them, molested me as a child. The trauma that I carried from those experiences was big and ugly, and often exploded in places like dormitory stairwells. Made me want to binge and purge, to cut myself, sometimes even to die. And that night, it came spilling out. Russ just stood there, helpless, wondering what to do next. Like many of us, especially men, Russ had been taught to fight, flight, or fix, yet none of those responses seemed quite right in the moment. Like most of us, Russ's heart knew how to feel, but he had absolutely no idea what to say. Like most of us, Russ wanted to support me, a survivor of sexual violence, but he didn't know where to start. So that night, we started with an uncomfortable conversation, the first of many that we'd have over the years. So my history as a survivor taught me the importance of simply breaking silence. And my passion for talking about sexual violence led me to a degree in women's studies and numerous volunteer roles with survivors and the organizations that serve them. It also led me to my first post-college apartment, a house with 6 male rowers, where I put that women's studies degree to good use, talking and listening to men about how they view the world. And for the last 4 years, I've interviewed and surveyed hundreds of men about the way the issue of sexual violence shows up in their lives. And here's what bugs me. Men are at the center of the public dialogue about rape, yet they are cast primarily as the rapists or aggressors. We teach men how not to rape. We teach men how to stop their friends from raping. But most men aren't rapists. Most men are husbands, brothers, fathers, sons of survivors who feel helpless and heartbroken in its wake. And we are failing to give them the skills, language, and support they need to become instruments of healing and change. So what if, instead of avoiding uncomfortable conversations about sexual violence, we could just get better at having them? And what if the key to unlocking those conversations weren't the words you chose, but the mindset you had going into them? And that's what I want to share with you. The 5 lessons that I've learned about that mindset, a mindset that can transform any conversation about sexual violence from one of shame and stigma to one of healing and transformation. So lesson number 1, tell the truth about sexual violence. What is the truth? The truth is that in the US, 1 in 4 women are sexually abused or assaulted in their lifetimes. And so are 1 in 6 men. The truth is that survivors are among us every day, all the time, right here in this room. The truth is that a man is more likely to be a victim than a perpetrator of sexual violence. Let me put that in terms of football for you. If you filled a football stadium with 60,000 men, you would be sitting among 13,000 survivors of sexual violence and 3,900 perpetrators. So think about your male friends right now. Have any of them told you they're survivors of sexual violence? Unsurprisingly, many men do not disclose they're survivors, sometimes for decades, and instead live with unbearable shame. What is typically visible is the result of that shame, not the cause of it. So I'm talking about that guy with a series of failed relationships who struggles with friendship or intimacy, faces alcoholism or addiction. My point is that we don't need to fear men, and men do not need to fear themselves. Gender is a part of this conversation, but it's not the whole conversation. Men and women are both survivors. Men and women are both perpetrators. These are the undeniable facts. So lesson number 2, get uncomfortable. So I kind of wish I were up here standing next to a robot talking about holograms, because this is an uncomfortable conversation. I'm uncomfortable, you're uncomfortable, but discomfort, that's the lesson. Discomfort means we're having the right conversation. And in my interviews with men, I've dug deeper into this discomfort. And I've learned that many men struggle with finding the perfect words, the magic words, the words that will make all the pain go away. It's uncomfortable knowing that there is no magic. There's no way to fix it, only a willingness to be present with another person's pain. Yet on the other hand, many men are uncomfortable at the possibility that they might say the wrong thing, whether talking to a friend who's disclosed he or she is a survivor or responding to an online posting about campus rape. Men realize it's a high-stakes conversation and they don't want to mess it up. The truth is that if your heart is in the right place, there is no right or wrong thing to say. I mean, I don't even remember what Russ said to me that night in the dormitory stairwell, just that he stuck out the discomfort long enough to be my friend. And that's the thing. When discomfort keeps us silent, we fail to show up for the survivors who need us, and even worse, we don't get any better at talking about sexual violence, because talking about uncomfortable things is a skill. Being uncomfortable is a skill. It takes practice. The more you do it, the better you'll get. Just ask Russ. So lesson number 3, drop the blame game. So it's natural for us to look for someone to blame when it comes to sexual violence. Blame is simple and straightforward. It makes one person or side wrong and another right. Blame promises us a solution, but it usually fails to deliver. So in my life, I sometimes wished a stranger had raped me, because it's so much easier to blame a stranger. But the people who violated me, my grandparents, both of them, a male friend in high school, these were people I loved, trusted, and welcomed into my life. Blaming them meant blaming myself for letting them close. And the more I looked for someone to blame, the worse I felt. And so my personal blame game follows much of what we see in the larger sexual violence movement today. Men and women both blame the victims. They were drunk, they didn't report, they didn't fight back. Men and women both blame the perpetrators. These people are monsters. They can't be in my family with my friendship circle and my campus or my community. And we, well, mostly women, we blame men. Men are silent, complicit, ignorant. Masculinity itself is toxic. Men are being raised to rape. But here's something I learned about blame. Blame distances us from each other. Blame makes us focus on the cause of the problem, not our role in the solution. Blame doesn't start a conversation, it ends one. And blame creates shame. And we certainly don't need any more shame when it comes to sexual violence. So lesson number 4, be practical. So when Russ and I were standing in that dormitory stairwell 20 years ago, he did not need a theoretical dissertation on gender violence and masculinity. He needed to know which words should come out of his mouth in that moment. So here is a piece of practical advice for you. The next time you encounter a survivor of sexual violence, stop, breathe, look them in the eye and say, "I'm so sorry that happened to you. Nobody deserves to be hurt that way." So I wish I could give you a script or be with you for every conversation that you'll have about sexual violence in your life, but that is hardly realistic. So instead, we all need to embrace practical questions. What should I do if somebody comes to me after being raped? What should I say? What should I not say? Should I hug the person? Yes, you can hug them, just ask first. What can I expect dating a survivor of sexual violence? How do I talk about consent with my partner? How do I raise my kids not to rape? You know, I say, go ahead and ask your practical questions. Ask all of them. They aren't dumb or embarrassing, they're real. Practical questions don't deserve our judgment, they deserve answers. We can move on to the deeper understanding and conversation over time. Lesson number 5, believe in healing. Sexual violence is ugly. It reminds us of our capacity for evil, of our capacity to set aside human dignity in pursuit of our own power, of our ability to break people's minds, bodies, and spirits. Yet that moment of abuse, of assault, of rape, it cannot and will not define survivors like me forever. Because survivors are also gifted with the capacity to heal. We are resilient, especially when we stand in solidarity with each other and the men and women who love us. So last summer, Russ and I ran one of those obstacle races. It was 5 miles in the 90-degree heat, over hills and through tunnels, and we got muddy, scraped up, bruised, sore, but he was with me every step of the way. This is survival. It's not something that you do alone. It's something you do together. And it all started with a single conversation in a dormitory stairwell. Just a single conversation. And what continues to inspire me about this work is the kind of change and transformation that takes place when you simply talk about sexual violence. The acts of navigating these uncomfortable conversations with your friends, your family, your campus, your community, these are acts of solidarity with survivors. These are acts of disruption of the systems of shame, silence, and oppression that have created a world in which sexual violence can and does take place at unacceptable rates. So that first conversation you have, it's going to be hard, but we just had our first conversation. How hard could it be to have just one more, especially when the price of not talking about sexual violence is far too high? So take the lessons that I've learned and try them out for yourself. Reassure that friend you know is a survivor that you'll always have his or her back. Ask your mom or your dad how old they were when they first encountered a survivor of sexual violence and how it impacted their lives. Make sure those young children in your life know that you'll always listen and believe. Prepare your teen to help a friend who's been sexually assaulted. Talk about consent with your guy friends the next time you're watching the game. I mean, what is the worst thing that's going to happen? Maybe you'll stick your foot in your mouth. If you do, take it out. More likely, you'll get better at talking about sexual violence. More likely, you'll create a little bit of love and support for a survivor who needs it, a survivor who has endured their suffering in silence for far too long. Imagine what we could change if we each had just one of those conversations today.